Well, we're really happy you've been able to make it with us. You obviously have. You're here, and so I'm thankful for that. Thankful for the opportunity to get another crack at a sermon that I just preached 45 minutes ago. See if I can make improvements on it. As most of you know, just because I have it on the outline doesn't mean that's what you're going to always see. And so consequently, I can come up with seemingly different things even when I'm preaching the same thing. So I still hope it's worthwhile to you. Dave mentioned that we're preaching from the Old Testament, and I did start something in that regard, not necessarily purposefully, but last week I talked about the parable of Israel. And, one of the reasons why we find encouragement and hope from the Old Testament is Paul talked about it in the letter to the Roman church. The whole Old Testament's kind of a parable. In other words, yes, it's historically accurate, but at the same time, there's just a lot of stories in there for me and for you. And so what I've done last week is I looked at the parable, if you will, of Israel. And we're going to look at another angle of it, and it comes from the book of Judges. If you have the outline in front of you, it says, after leaving Egypt and settling in the Promised Land, the nation of Israel lives in what I call an on-again, off-again state of chaos. And it was generally built on the idea that they couldn't really shake the worshiping of idols. This was something that when they were in Egypt, it became really a very profound part of the way they looked at things around them and the way they associated with the culture. And even though they recognized the power of God, they also leaned very heavily on idols. And that was the problem. And God always promised, if you worship me faithfully, I will stay with you. If you don't, then I will leave you, or ultimately I will do what? I will remove you from the land that I have promised you. And so in the book of Judges, what you're reading about is a time after Moses, after Joshua, they had ostensibly settled, although it never really seems to as you're reading in the book of Judges. There are places that had not been settled yet, and I don't know to what extent they had completely been settled. But during that time of the book of the Judges, as we call that period of time, they lived under some people who led them out of difficulty. When they started complaining and murmuring to God, God would send them someone, and they returned as judges, meaning they come in and they lead and they make decisions for the people, and the whole idea was to get them to return to God. By the time you get to Judges chapter 17, that period is over. In Judges 16, you read about Samson, and Samson's the last judge in the book of Judges. And so when we get to the end of it, we get somewhat of a, I don't know how purposeful it was, but it's a summary of what we read about that time. And so in lieu of the things that are going on that may allow our thinking to be a bit discouraged by the world in which we live, I want us to still remember that what we have is God's word revealed to us, and whatever may be going on, even though we'll look at it and we'll describe it as really, really bad, things just aren't really good, and because we have somewhat limited experience. I mean, the older we are, the more experiences I suppose that we have in knowing what's really awful, but just how bad can it get when certain things are going on? How bad can it get in a country? How bad can it get in a church? How bad can it get with any people who prescribe any sort of belief in Christ? Just how bad can it get? And so what happens when it starts looking bad? And it is, in some ways, very bad. Well, to understand what's going on previous to what we're going to be discussing is to know that there was the time when Moses was a very strong leader and the people still wavered. Joshua, he was spending most of his time just trying to get people settled into the land of Canaan. So we don't read a whole lot about the things that he taught, even though he's like Moses. He has the occasional speech that he gives, and there's some very, very powerful sayings that come out of the things of Joshua. But what's happening here with these individuals is we've got these powerful guys who've been very strong leaders. Doesn't mean that people didn't sway just because Moses was around or just because Joshua was around. And you know that from the period of time, especially with Moses, during that time prior to going to the land of Canaan, just how much they complained and how much they were rebelling against God. And that's, of course, during that period when they actually built an idol themselves. And, of course, that's the golden calf. And so what we read about these individuals in Judges chapter 2 is that Joshua was at the end of his life. And so there was some sort of wake or celebration for him, a period of mourning, and then everybody else who was a part of that generation, it says down there in verse 10, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. So all the people who were there wandering in the wilderness, they eventually die, and then now another generation lives and they die. And these people are described this way. Look at verse 10. All that generation, this is Judges chapter 2, also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Go figure. I mean, it is one of those things for those of us who have this book in front of us and we have the opportunity to read it from cover to cover or read certain historical sections of it. We understand that these people fall away. But I think there's a part of us that just doesn't really buy into it a whole lot. We don't really understand. How can they completely forget? How can they forget so quickly? Well, it's because a certain philosophy is dominating the way they generally look at the world. And that's where it gets very similar to me and to you. Because we live in very much the same world as they lived in the time of the judges. Maybe not quite as violent as it was in those days, but we have all seen a lot of violence over the past few months, and one never knows where that might head. But in verse 11 it says, the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. And you understand the Baals. It kind of represents all the false idols that they observed, but it was an actual idolatrous god. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they started following other gods. So you know the pattern. Those of you in here and those of you who may still be out in the parking lot, you understand this pattern that they often found themselves in. And so they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Okay, so that was the pattern. They could be faithful to God, and then certain cultural things, whatever it may be, spiritual matters, however it may develop, becomes a problem, and they turn away from God. And then God's promise to them, as being of the 12 tribes of Israel, is that I will take care of you guys. But if you turn yourself over to idols, that's it. And he would express, I think, understanding and belief and patience and all those kinds of things for so long, but eventually what would happen, he would allow them to go so far, and then he would say, okay, that's it, you're gone. So wherever they went, the Lord was against them because of their evil. All right, now, so that's the pattern. That's what we saw all through the book of Judges. In and out of idolatry. But a verse that comes out of Judges, which we often associate with the whole book, describes what I call the life theme, because it helps me to understand, okay, what happens when certain things occur or don't occur. In point number one, it's what happens when you've had seemingly good leaders doing their job. Well, it generally turned out pretty well for the people of Israel. With Moses and with Joshua. But after that, they really didn't have the true steady hand. And the people are in the land, and they're trying to settle in the land. Joshua's trying to direct that. But during that time, something happens. And this is what equates very much with the
cultural thoughts that we have today around us. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, I find it interesting that even though, as I've read the book of Judges many, many times, I've always thought that this verse was about in every chapter of the book of Judges, but it's not. It's at the end of the book of Judges, and it's when a life theme had truly been established amongst these people. Remember, they have no leader to really hold them together, and so that makes it difficult for them to follow the things that they ought to be following. And so the way that things generally evolve is that as the general way of looking at life diminishes in terms of being a united view of how you get through life, then what do people do? Well, I'm just going to do what I want to do. It's a very natural thing. And for those of us who are Bible-believing people, and we see these patterns in the Old Testament, and then we see the importance of being obedient to God after Jesus comes and through the teachings of the apostles and all those things, we understand that words of truth about how to live as a Christian are obviously supposed to be significant to us, and there's a reason for it. You know, why do we keep saying you got to live by what God's word teaches? You got to follow the Bible. It's because the other way of looking at life, doing what is right in your own eyes, leads to certain things. And they're not good in terms of our relationship with God. So when we get over to chapter 17, there's a story about a family. And you get a real good sense of what's going on by what happens with this family in terms of why had people gone so quickly to where they had gone, seemingly. So what happens when this approach to life becomes accepted? And maybe they don't even know. I think this is what happens a lot, is people don't really know why they believe certain things. And I think that can be true of all of us. And the next thing, you know, we're just doing things because someone told us that we're right, but we haven't really put it into our own hearts intellectually and emotionally and spiritually. And so we're not really sure why we're doing things. But what I'm trying to tell us this morning is what's really important is that when you get to the point where you say, well, I don't really care what other people do. And that's a fairly easy way of going about life. I mean, being around people can sometimes be very hard. It can be a real struggle. And so you don't really enjoy being around them, and so what happens? Well, you start looking into yourself. I'm going to do what's right in my own eyes. Well, here's this family. There's a mom here, and she has a son named Micah. And so he says that there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. It's not Micah the prophet. This is another Micah. And he said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me, and I took it. Now, I don't know what this curse was, but it obviously kind of put in this guy's heart the sense that I need to straighten this thing out. Maybe she had said something, placed, some sort of a damning sort of statement on the individual who stole the money, and this is really working on his head, and he finally decides, he's going to go to his mom, and he's going to confess to what he had done. And so, like mothers tend to be pretty understanding in most situations, and usually defending children, especially when they're our own, is kind of a natural thing. So, you might think, if you're looking at a strict view of right and wrong here, if that existed, she would say, well, I'm sorry that you did this, but you're going to have to change. You're going to have to repent. But she says, blessed be my son by the Lord. Blessed be him. So she's really happy. I mean, because he's done the right thing. And that's a good thing, isn't it? So I certainly don't condemn that, and nor should I. So he returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord. Now, you ought to be reading that, and you're thinking, that's a good thing. I want the Lord to have some benefit from this. And then what follows is kind of shocking. when you really believe that they really want to do what's right, they really want to follow God, she says to the Lord, for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now, therefore, I will return them to you. I mean, hopefully you're thinking or in a mixed up kind of way, at least the way most of us are, particularly when we maybe don't give it complete interrogation in our own minds. Well, what does it mean when everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes? Let's give the money, or at least part of it, to the Lord. And so what will we do? Well, let's build a couple of idols. How does that happen? And that should at least, obviously, it's real easy for us to look at that and say, I thought you wanted to follow God, so give the money to God and let's go build some idols. So that probably should tell you and me that there's something very deeply ingrained in the people. And they don't even really understand what it means to have a relationship with the one true God. I don't think it means that there were bad people, and I think this is important. That's why you and I, we study the Word of God, and we try to live according to the words of God. Yes, we're faulty, and we make mistakes and all those kinds of things, but we should never get to the point where we look at our relationship with God and everybody else's relationship with God and say, well, it doesn't really matter. Just do what you think is right. And we know that's the way a lot of people think. We can't do that. So when you look at that, you ought to say, wait a minute. If she wants to really see that money go to the service of God, well, then why are they building idols? So Micah returned some money to his mother, and he'd stolen the money. What demonstrated the rejection of God's authority and the theme, which now dominated the nation. So I think, to me, what demonstrates it is that there seems to be no question about this being the right or the wrong thing to do. Just do it. And they've got people worshiping idols all around them. And so I asked you to at least evaluate them as people, such as it is. I mean, God's the one that's going to judge them. But if you and I are going to learn something, if we're going to get the parable, then it's going to make sense to us by asking the question, were these two people religious? Well, you'd have to say yes, at least on the surface. I mean, you've known people who have little shrines in their home, and I mean, it gives the impression that someone's religious. Always does. If you happen to see something like that. Is there any indication that they are not sincere? No, I don't think there is. I mean, I'm not going to question their motive. I mean, it seems like, they're wanting to do the right thing. She thinks it's a good idea. He goes along with it as a good idea. But remember, you ought to be thinking, well, how is it that would just seem okay to them? And I think the reason why is simply this. They had been living according to this way of life that said, we're all just out here doing what's right in our own eyes. And I'm sure there were plenty of people who would be saying, oh, yes, this is really good, because no one has a right to tell anyone what's right or wrong. And times change. What was wrong 30 years ago, may not be wrong now. That's so true, isn't it? And what do you get in reply if you say, look, I'm not in favor of that? It's against what the Bible teaches. And someone says, well, things have changed. It's not like it was when your parents were here, or it's not like it was when you were young. Things change. So how would I describe their belief system? Well, there's certainly a lack of purity in it. I think we would all agree with that. And the fact that the first thing they thought about when they thought about doing something to serve God, it included idols. And how does it get to that point? Moses would have spoken out against it. Joshua would have spoken out against it. So anyway, he returns the silver to his mother, and they give them the money to the silversmith, and he makes these graven images, molten images, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine he made, and he made an ephod. This would be part of a vest wearing of an individual who might lead worship inside the shrine. Household idols, and consecrated one of his sons that he might become a priest. We need a priest. We need one. So one of my sons will become the priest. It kind of helps us to be official. And then it's at the end of that, and this is why I think it's really helpful for me and for you to put this into some sort of a summary where we're thinking, why would they do this? And that's why it says, and I think why you and I ought to look at verse 6, which is, it's not an accident that the Holy Spirit would put it there. Here's why this seemed to make sense. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. So that tells you, if you're wondering, well, was that okay now? Well, it wasn't okay. But it just wasn't really considered at all to be questionable in people's minds. So he gets himself all set up, and I suppose that made Micah feel pretty good because he's maybe paying God back in his own way, and he's trying to take on a new way of getting through life. I mean, he's the kind of guy who stole money from his mom, and now he's repented of what it is he had done, and so we're going to show respect for God. And that's what came out. And so you and I go, well, wait a minute, again, why? Well, that's why. Everybody was doing what was right in his own eyes. So anyway, there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he was staying there. He was down there. He's talking about when he was in Judah. But it says he departs from the city, from Bethlehem in Judah, to stay wherever he might find a place. And there were Levite cities all over the region. And I don't know what happened to him in Judah. I don't know if he wasn't happy living there, or he didn't like some of the things that maybe were going on in the various worship places. And so he left. And as he made his journey, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. So he travels north from Jerusalem, and Micah, the guy probably came by and was looking for water or something like that. And so Micah then says to him, well, where'd you come from? And he said to him, well, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to stay wherever I may find a place. I'm a professional, and I'm looking for a place maybe where I might be able to work. And you can imagine, how this might be clicking in the brain of Micah. Boy, this is good. I mean, I got myself a real live Levite who can help us lead this religion, what we're practicing and what we're doing in our home. I mean, that's going to give us a certain level of legitimacy. It's nice to have my son doing it, but this is a pro. And so Micah gives him a salary. Read about that in verse 10. I don't know why I didn't put that in there, but nevertheless, you can read that. It says he got some remuneration for what he had done and what he was about to do. And the Levite agreed to live with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So the Levite just became one of the family. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. And then notice how it's summed up. This is the end of chapter 17. Follow with me now. Then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me, seeing I have a Levite as priest. I don't know why we think that way. That we need a professional person to sort of give it a certain amount of validity to what it is we're doing. And that's exactly what he was thinking. We've got it now. We have it the way it's supposed to be. I'm provided a place for people to worship. I was thinking about God when we built it, and I got a real live Levite. Now, you might think that the Levite may go, okay, well, what are you doing here? And he says, well, we've got these images. And he would then say, what? Well, wait a minute, this is not right. But he doesn't. In fact, he just takes his place, and he is now the priest, the Levite for that family. And so I'm trying to help us to see, and this is really what you read in point number 2 when I say this is what happens when a family has what I call a deep rejection of God. It's something they don't even realize. It's so deep. But the reality is, they're looking to God and looking to live according to what God authorizes is just not even something they really even consider. They didn't even think about it being wrong. And if they did, nothing really changed. But what Micah thinks is that I've got this Levite here, now everything's going to be okay. What did it say in chapter 17, verse 13? It said, now I'm going to be able to be good. God's going to prosper me. It's just the way it ought to be. And so that helps me to understand what kind of subtext there was to what was going on. How do people get that bad where this seemed like the right thing to do? Well, we all know that probably most people really didn't condemn it around them, so that takes the heat off that. But it also tells you and me that things aren't so great when we see that there was a Levite who was quite willing to just join in all of it. That lack of respect for the authority of God. Well, okay, not only does it affect worship or one's worshipful relationship with God, it also takes us to another level, and that is when you don't really have law by which you guide yourself. You know, Paul talks about the importance of law in 1 Timothy chapter 1, and laws for bad people. Because if you don't have laws, the bad people go unchecked. Most of us can live, as far as our relationship with the people around us, we don't really need to have all kinds of rules to follow because we generally know how you go about treating people. But we need to have laws for the bad guys because that's what's going to keep society somewhat ordered. So when you hear people talking about how we need to get rid of the police, this is just silly. How does a society exist without those who will support the law? And so here's what happens. These people now not only are not really following God according to how you ought to be treating God, and they're still worshiping idols, they now demonstrate a lack of respect for other people and their property. So I say there's no respect for the authority of God leads to every man for himself. Or you might look at it just the opposite. You might say if you look at life that way, every man is for himself, well then you're not thinking about how what you do is going to affect other people. And so I will take from you what I want, and as long as you're strong, as long as I'm strong, then nobody's going to stop me. And so I try to point out that's why enforcing the law in a society is so important. But here's what happens, and let me see if I can wrap this up in 5 minutes. I think I will be able to. So there was no king in Israel, and there were some Danites. Danites, one of the tribes, and they had a region that was dedicated to them. And if you look in the earlier part of the book of Judges, what you'll find out is that they didn't really successfully settle in their place because a group of tribesmen there, the Amorites, which you read a lot of in the Old Testament, prevented them from taking the land. And so they really didn't have a permanent place. And so it says that they were seeking an inheritance for themselves to live in, for until the day an inheritance had not been allotted to them as a possession among the tribes of Israel. But that doesn't mean they didn't have it. It just means they didn't really take it. It hadn't really officially become theirs because they didn't go in and destroy the Amorites. Terrible people, by the way. So the sons of Dan sent from their family 5 men out of their whole number, valiant men from Zorah and Eshtaol, those are some cities, to spy out the land and search it out. And they said to them, well, go search the land. Okay, we're not sure why they're doing it, but he says, go search the land. So they come to the hill country of Ephraim, and they end up at the house of Micah. And they stayed there a little while, it says in verse 2. So when they were there near the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young man, the Levite. Now that's fascinating. This is many, many miles from where they started, but they recognized the voice of this Levite. Now, I don't know if one of the places he went looking for a job was where they were. I don't know. As I said earlier this morning, maybe the way he spoke the language was a little bit different, and so they recognized that. And so they say, well, who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place? And what is it that you have here? Now, in verse 4 then says, he said to them, now he's going to explain to them. He says, thus and so has Micah done to me, and he has hired me, and I have become his priest. Okay, so they're thinking, okay, we got an official priest here, so let's engage him in how he can give approval to what we're doing. They said to him, inquire of God, please, that we may know whether our way on which we are going will be prosperous. The priest said to them, go in peace, your way in which you are going has the Lord's approval. Now, I don't know whether he was really sincere about helping them or if he just was saying what they wanted to hear. Are we going to be blessed? Is it going to be prosperous? Yeah, sure, go away. So they depart, and they come across these people. They saw the people who were in it living in this little land in the city of Laish, and after the manner of the Sidonians. The Sidonians were not part of the family of Israel, and it was a coastal town that was generally Gentile for its total existence. But these people had come down from Sidon and were now in the area of where the land of promise is. But they're not bothering anybody. It says their way was quiet and secure, for there was no ruler humiliating them for anything in the land, and they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. So they're just kind of quietly existing there. And so those 5 guys go back and they report what they saw. Remember now, we know what they're looking for. They're looking for a new place. And they go to a place where there are individuals who are there who are easy takings. There's just no doubt about it. They're just peace-loving people, found a nice place to live. The Danites didn't do their own job with the Amorites, so they're thinking, hey. And they didn't believe that God was helping them, and so now what are they going to do? Now we'll really get some land from some people who are just weak, and look at us, we're strong. So they put together a small army, 500 or 600 people, and they go up there, and as they're traveling through there, they go back through Micah's house, and they steal from him. They take all that stuff that they saw that Micah had there in his house. And then the priest is pretty upset about that. And so they say to him, well, look, you can just come along with us. And he didn't say, no, that wouldn't be the right thing. After you just stole all these things from Micah's house. He goes along with them. He takes a better job. That just shows you a little bit about the fiber of these individuals at that time. And so as they're carrying things off, Micah sees them taking all this stuff, and he says, well, what are you doing? And they say to him, well, it doesn't matter what we're doing. But what then happens is they tell him, look, if you want to live, and I'm paraphrasing there, just keep your mouth shut, or your life is going to get really hard to live. So then from there they go on and they travel on and they conquer that quiet and unsuspecting people. Now here's my point there. We can maybe debate about why someone hadn't run those people out already, but they didn't. And of course Israel was living at peace with most of the people around them. But I tell you what, it just shows you the kind of atmosphere. These guys are unsuspecting, they're quiet, they're peaceful people. All we got to do is take in our army and we'll destroy them and we'll take this land. Might makes right. That's what happens when you live in a culture where people do everything that's right in their own eyes. It's the strong people who determine not to be regulated by law who begin to try to take over the world around them. And that's how the Danites are behaving here. They should have already taken the land already taken the land where they had it allocated to them, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't defeat the Amorites. So rather than really doing what God said, they just go up and find these people that would be easy to destroy, and that's exactly what they do. Now, that's what I'm talking about here. What happens when things get really bad? And as we see things develop maybe in our own culture, when there is a breakdown of respect for God and respect for the authority of God, it starts affecting not only maybe what religious people are doing, but it has its tentacles stretching out, and it also respects in some ways, and in some respects, what it is that causes people to think so lowly of people who they can overpower. We're not going to follow laws. We're just going to get what we want. So that's what happens. That's what happens when people do what is right in their own eyes. There's little respect for God and authority of his teaching, and then ultimately society pays for it. So I hope this gives you at least something to consider. Appreciate your patience with me this morning. And I'm hoping that as we look at this story, again, it helps us to understand our own place in time right now, doesn't it? At least it does for me. It helps me to understand some things that are going in our own world. And so that's why you and I have to do what we can to hold up the truth of God as being the only way to live. And then maybe it's going to get us to be able to affect others around us in a positive way, because I think if we don't, then we're going to be headed more and more toward that atmosphere that allowed the Danites to just go up and ignore what God had said about the land that they wanted, and they just took what was easy. It's because they didn't care about people. Thank you very much.